Today we're going to work on a pantograph pattern. So when I'm talking about the pins, on the backing I just pin it in the center of the backing at the top and at the bottom. On the batting, I find my center with my safety pin, but I'm only needing one pin to find the middle of where my batting is at. So now that everything is centered in relationship to the canvas, then I start pinning, starting in the middle, and I go from right to left, and I stagger my pins, and then I come back to the center, and I stagger my pins to the left, and then I come back and I fill them in head to point. What head to point means is the head of the pin to the end, the point of the next pin. You see that? Head, point, head, point. And the reason why I move from center out in both directions is I'm easing in the fullness and I'm keeping everything centered. Now, one thing I want to tell you when it comes to long arming is it's very important. The backing and the batting has to be 6 inches wider in width and length. So let's say, for example, this top is 50 inches. Your backing fabric would have to be 56 by 56 inches. And your batting would have to be cut, adding the same 6 inches. So the batting would have to be 56 by 56. And the reason why you want that extra on both ends is because as you quilt and the density of quilting comes from the top to the bottom, you want to make sure that you're going to, when you get to the end, you're not going to run out of backing or batting. Because when the quilting process, it starts to pull itself in. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to leave the backing safety pin there. The most important pin that you don't ever want to remove are the pins that you have on your quilt top. If you had to take the quilt off, turn the quilt, or whatever, and you trimmed the quilt and then you needed to remount it to the machine, then at least you would have these pins as your center point to align it to your canvas. You just want to clamp your clamps on the end to hold those 2 layers together. And then you want to check underneath to make sure that your backing is smooth and flat. So you do not want to pull these clamps so tight that you're pulling your backing fabric. I just want you to see that there. It's not up, I want you to see that. You just got to kind of position them that they hold those 2 layers together. Now, this is a trick that I love. I was taught this early on in the beginning. I love my yardsticks. So once I place my clamps in position, and I always check underneath to see my backing is smooth, then I put my little yardsticks here, and they take up the slack. See how the quilt kind of sinks down? I use my yardsticks, and I just set them underneath the clamps, and now my quilt top, my backing, and my batting are all really nice and flat and smooth. When you baste your top of your quilt to the batting and the backing, on my machine I have a horizontal channel lock. So what I do first is I take my safety pins and I make sure that my safety pins are, perpendicular with the center of the canvas and the quilt top. And on my machine I have a basting stitch feature. So I have the settings at 1/2 inch. So it's going to create a straight line. But quickly, if you don't have those features, but you want to try to make a straight line, so you're able to find a line that you can align your quilt top evenly to your upper take-up roller, then here's what you can do. You can take your stitch length per inch and make it longer, and then as you're dragging it across the machine, it'll act like a basting stitch, And in order to make sure that your line is even, you can use your ruler as a guide. See, I used a darker thread so that you could see where to line up your top. And then as long as you just like center your safety pins, you're good to go. So then you want to run another basting stitch along the edge of your top. Now, here's a quick tip. If you had a lot of fullness in your border, if you walk your hand behind the foot, okay, and then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna tighten my top. And like I said, I don't want it so tight that it's like a trampoline and you want to flip a quarter off of it. No, that's not a good. You just want to make it so that the layers are really nice and soft. And you hear that little sound? It's like burping a baby. Okay, so the darning foot here and the needle is about 1/4 of an inch. Well, it actually is 1/4 of an inch. So once I get to this end, I'm going to put my hand in front of the needle and I'm going to baste along this edge. Of the quilt. It's not really necessary to lock off your stitches. You could just like back tack one stitch because these aren't going to be permanent. The distance between your take-up roller and the throat plate of your machine is very, very important. So every time you advance that quilt, you want to check this. And the distance of this take-up roller in relationship to the throat plate of your machine, if you want to know how high to raise that up, you just gonna set it so your fingertips just go up against underneath, okay? You don't want your whole fingers to go in there. You just want your fingertips. The reason why you have to reposition your laser light is because in actuality, this is where the pattern starts sewing. So if the laser light matches the needle, we're going to start right here and we're going to do our stitching. We don't want to do that. There is a reference standard. It's 3/4 of an inch, but you do not want it to be any less than 1/2 of an inch in distance. The space that you set your laser light in between each row is going to maintain the same distance as you're sewing one row on top of the other. And the reason why that is important is when you're looking at a pantograph pattern, you want to make sure that at the bottom of the first row where it ends, and now the top of the second row that comes in, over the distance of the quilt top, you want to make that appear even. And that's the purpose behind setting your laser light correctly. So no matter how many rows you're going to sew, you know in between each and every row, there's just going to be the same amount of distance to separate those rows. So it's going to look more uniform and consistent. On this pattern in particular, the designer, Judy Lyons, took the time to give us some parameters in relationship to her pattern. So 3/4 of an inch doesn't give us what we need. That's a little bit too wide. So like I said, you go 3/4 or 1/2 of an inch from the edge of the pattern. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to take that laser light. We're going to come in on the quilt 1/4 of an inch because that's the distance of the needle to the darning foot. We're going to take our ruler. See, we're really, really close. See, I am on the corner, but I came in on 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to show you that laser light right there. And you want to make sure that that screw is tight. I mean, you don't have to, just tighten it with your fingers. So now you see where my laser light is? It's right here. And if you take that measurement, it's 1/2 inch from where your stitching line is away. Okay, so now we're on the quilt. I readjusted my laser light, so my laser light is working like my needle. So now when I take my laser light and I glide along the edge of the outside of the quilt at the top row, and I glide this along like that, I haven't stitched my pattern yet. However, I'm 1/4 inch in, which will take into consideration my binding. Then the second check you want to see is where that stitching is going to go. So we're good on that. Okay, so now let's move on. Now, how do we set these? Now that we've established that the laser light matches our needle. Okay, so what we want to do now is this is where our handy dandy rulers come in. So now I'm on this side of the quilt. This is the line, right? So I'm going to be off the line. So in order to establish the edge of the quilt, I'm going to align my ruler on each side with my laser light. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come and I'm just going to go the farthest distance of the pattern. And then I'm just going to adjust my rulers and tape them down on each end. Okay? So now I got that side. So I'm square here and I'm set up there. So we are good to go. So now what we're going to do is we're going to come down here using this ruler, but we're going to be on the inside. But what this ruler is set for is it's going to tell me when I'm off the edge of the quilt, because so when I know that I'm sewing, I don't just keep on sewing or hit a clip or whatever. It's going to set that for me. So now, again, I use the same procedure. Tape that down. Take a piece and tape this down. Now the last step that we have to do is in relationship to the space in between each row and knowing when you advance the quilt where this laser light is going to stop. So you don't have to change anything. What you're going to do is I use painter's tape. All right, so when I check my laser light with the edge of the tape, and now I'm on the quilt and my quilt is down, it's 1/2 inch here. First thing you want to do is you want to drop your needle and bring your bobbin thread up to the top. Now, you want to lock your stitches. And if you're on the back of the machine, here's a good way of doing that. You want to rotate your thread. Back and forth. And then relax and let's get started. Now when you're working with a pantograph, it's important to stay as close on the lines as possible.